more time?
I think we can get it going.
Okay, Rebecca, you're brutal. Okay,
I just want to get it over it.
Everybody has their drinks and nibbles and everything's good. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Peterson, and I want to thank you for joining us for Libations in the Library. Tonight, we're celebrating and toasting to, so hopefully you all have drinks, the publication of two remarkable books, Gendered Citizenship and Her Cold War, written by two equally remarkable people, Dr. Rebecca DeWolf and Dr. Tanya Roth. These books are the culmination of years and years of hard work and dedication, and tonight we will salute, pun intended, your achievement. As a historian myself, I can attest to history still being a pretty male-dominated field, and read that as recently as 2016, around 70% of history books were authored by men, with no current studies suggesting that number's dramatically changed in recent years. And I'm not saying that's sexist in any way or symptomatic of sexism, since it's shown that fewer women generally choose to study history and become historians. Nevertheless, it does remind me that Virginia Woolf once wrote, "For most of history, Anonymous was a woman." For it is not long ago that women were not authors or subjects of history books. So there is much to celebrate in the fact that two well-respected historians who also happen to be women are making sure that the stories, experiences, and struggles of 20th century women are given the attention they deserve. These are books you'll want in your personal library and, if applicable, in your classroom. So don't take it from me, though, because you guys have had fantastic reviews. And some of those saying groundbreaking, meticulously researched, crucial contributions to women's history, military history, and US and social cultural history. In a couple of minutes, Rebecca and Tanya will give an overview of their research, and then we'll open up for a discussion, I think potentially briefly, and then a Q&A. So I think what I'm gonna do is actually open it up to a Q&A for everybody at that point. And if you'd like to ask a question at any point, feel free to raise your hand, which is the little icon on the bottom, so the third one in. Keeping in mind, you are being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, feel free to write a comment, which is going to be on the right-hand side with the little comment bubble. And throughout the presentation, we thought it might be fun to introduce a drinking game. So whenever anybody is mentioning the word equality, take a sip of your chosen beverage, which could be kind of interesting to see how that goes. And Rebecca, are you ready to start? Because I don't want to push you if you want to wait just a minute.
No, I'm good to go. I just need to make sure I can figure out how to share my screen. So just give me one second, okay?
I might have the honor to introduce you. So
sorry.
No, go ahead and do that. That's why I just didn't want to push you. Rebecca DeWolf is a historian with a PhD in history from American University, and her research has achieved recognition through several fellowships and grants, such as the Dirksen Center Congressional Research Grant, and her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, New York America Weekly, Frontiers, and History News Network. Her newly released book, Gendered Citizenship, The Original Conflict Over the Equal Rights Amendment, 1920 to 1963, explores how the first struggle over the ERA transcended traditional political divides in the early to mid-20th century United States, and ultimately redefined the concept of American citizenship. And with that, I'll leave it to you when you're ready.
All right, thank you. Okay, so just bear with me. I need to do this the right way. I'm gonna, okay. Let's see. Okay, do you guys see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, yay. Okay, so thank you for joining us tonight. As Tracy said, my name is Rebecca DeWolf, and I'm a historian with a PhD in history from American University. Sorry, I just need to get my thing working here. Okay, so my newly released book, Gendered Citizenship, builds on my PhD research. That research looks at the changing nature of American citizenship after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so for those that aren't as familiar with the history, I'll just note that the 19th Amendment removed sex as a valid reason for withholding the right to vote. It's often known as the amendment that affirmed women's right to vote. So one of my main areas of historical research has been to look at how the removal of sex as a valid reason for withholding the right to vote impacted America's legal tradition, because so much of the American legal system was built around the idea that only men were fit for rights-bearing citizenship. So tonight I want to discuss a few of the key aspects of my book with you all. My book explores the competing civic ideologies embedded in the original conflict over the Equal Rights Amendment. And many of you might be thinking, okay, what the heck does she mean by competing civic ideologies, and what does that have to do with the 19th Amendment? And wasn't the ERA basically dead until the 1970s? And tonight I'm going to try to sort that all out. It's probably best to first lay out some of the ERA's basic historical background. Even though much attention has been paid to the ERA struggle as it unfolded in the 1970s, the amendment was actually first devised in the early 1920s. In 1923, after an arduous, almost 3-year drafting process, Alice Paul of the National Woman's Party and the principal author of the ERA settled on a version of the amendment which read, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States in every place subject to its jurisdiction." In December of that year, Senator Charles Curtis and Representative Daniel Reed Anthony Jr. introduced the ERA into Congress. In 1943, Alice Paul reworded the amendment so that it aligned more closely with the language of the 19th Amendment. So to this day, the amendment reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." So the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, is a sex equality amendment. The underlying point of the ERA is to ensure that a single standard of rights applies to men and women equally in order to prohibit sex from being a legitimate legal classification in and of itself. In other words, the intent is to combat sex discrimination in the law and government policies and to make sure that sex cannot be used as a legal reason for withholding women's rights as citizens. Despite a vigorous decades-long battle, the ERA did not pass Congress until March 22, 1972. It then went to the states for ratification. Even though the initial fate of the amendment had looked promising, it, for example, had achieved 30 state ratifications by the end of 1973, the amendment ended up failing to gain the 38 state ratifications required for ratification of a constitutional amendment by its 1982 deadline. The ERA had gained 35 state ratifications by 1977, but that number was 3 states short of the necessary number it needed for full ratification. In recent years, since 2017, the ERA has gained 3 more state ratifications, presumably giving the amendment enough ratifications for full incorporation into the Constitution. But lingering questions surrounding the validity of the 1982 deadline and the issue of the 5 states that have rescinded their previous ratifications have prevented the ERA from being fully incorporated into the Constitution. And we can go over those present day issues in more detail during the discussion period. But for now, I'm going to focus on the major themes and contributions of my book. Much of the existing literature on the ERA examines the ratification struggle of the 1970s and early 1980s. So these works have been mostly concerned with figuring out why the ERA failed to get enough state ratifications when things had looked so promising for the amendment in the early 1970s. Some of these works look at the political difficulties ERA supporters encountered, and some of them look at Phyllis Schlafly's revitalization of grassroots conservatism and its devastating impact on the ERA state ratification battles. Yet these works tend to make it seem like the ERA struggle was silent or dormant or inconsequential before the 1970s. As I discuss in my book, if we want to know why the ERA failed to get enough state approvals during the 1970 state ratification battles, we have to return to the earlier conflict because the original ERA conflict created America's gendered citizenship. Now, there are a few other works that have explored the earliest years of the ERA conflict. These works have looked at the struggle mostly in the 1920s and a bit in the early 1930s. For the most part, these works understand the earliest years of the ERA struggle as a dispute among women, about women, and only concerning women. These works have mostly framed the early conflict as a fight between feminists over the priorities of the women's movement after the passage of the 19th Amendment. And according to their analyses, one group typically labeled social feminists worked to expand women's involvement in social reform programs, while the other group of feminists, sometimes identified as radical feminists or egalitarian feminists, single-mindedly focused on the effort to secure absolute sexual equality. So this second body of work primarily employs a female-centric narrative that emphasizes how the early ERA campaign affected the women's movement. Now, the previous writing on the ERA has offered incredibly important insights. But my study maintains that the original conflict is best understood not mainly as a struggle between feminist ideologies, but rather as a conflict between competing civic ideologies. So one of the things I attempted to show of my book is that the ERA conflict before the 1970s was not just a bunch of feminists arguing with one another about the priorities of women's activism after the 19th Amendment. To be clear, a crucial aspect of the original conflict did involve disputes among female activists over the priorities of the women's movement. But the focus on these disputes has concealed the larger story and significance of the ERA struggle. As I show in my book, when you take a wider view of the ERA conflict, so when you look at it before the 1970s and examine how the conflict involved more groups than just women activists who had been associated with the suffrage struggle, you start to see that the conflict involved more than just women fighting with one another over the trajectory of the women's movement. As I argue in my book, the original conflict not only involved former suffragists, but it actually included an array of men and women politicians, intellectuals, labor activists, social reformers, and government officials. Although strands of feminism undoubtedly influenced the aspects of the original battle, the larger conflict encompassed a struggle over the fundamental principles of American citizenship. So the participants in the original ERA conflict argued about the very idea of rights, and there were intense concerns about how to determine women's rights as citizens now that women presumably had a constitutional recognition of their right to vote. The story of the ERA begins with the passage of the 19th Amendment because that amendment profoundly altered women's relationship to the state. To start, the 19th Amendment disrupted the traditional understanding of American citizenship that had given men authority over women in law and in custom. Before the 19th Amendment, American political leaders and legal authorities upheld a single standard for full citizenship status, which venerated masculine strength and followed the common law tradition of domestic relations, or the doctrine known as coverture. According to coverture, women did not possess a direct relationship to the state. It also presumed that married women held no civic identity separate from their husband's status. When American lawmakers finally passed the 19th Amendment, it displaced this earlier societal framework that had given men authority over women, but it also failed to provide a unified set of principles for determining women's rights as citizens after sex had been removed as a valid reason for withholding the right to vote. Because of the destabilizing nature of the 19th Amendment, a period of constitutional uncertainty developed in which political leaders and legal authorities clashed over the constitutional implications of federal women's suffrage. At issue in these debates was whether voter status commanded other civic rights. In these debates, political leaders and legal authorities wrestled over the following questions. Did the passage of the 19th Amendment mean that women should be treated as citizens on similar terms with men? If women could now theoretically vote, what were their other rights? If sex was no longer a valid reason for denying the right to vote, could it still be a valid reason for restricting other rights? And what were the rights of citizenship? Is sex still a legitimate reason for limiting or restricting women's ability to serve on juries, hold public office, have an independent nationality status? And what about the array of state laws that still favored husbands and fathers over wives and daughters with relation to property, earnings, contracting, inheritance, and guardianship? So these debates played out in several court cases and in the political discourse of the post-19th Amendment era. The concerns and debates over these questions eventually morphed into the original ERA conflict, which produced two different ideas about American citizenship, which I call emancipationism and protectionism. So emancipationists were ERA supporters. They supported the ERA as a way to guarantee that men and women could participate as citizens on the same terms. Protectionists, on the other hand, opposed the ERA. They believed that what they saw as the inherently different societal functions of men and women citizens required the law to be free to treat citizens differently on account of sex. Overall, emancipationists contended that American ideals affirmed the right of men and women citizens to be held to the same legal standard, while protectionists maintained that true sexual equity demanded two standards of rights for men and women citizens. From the early 1920s to the early 1960s, which is the period that I identify as the original ERA conflict, these two warring views struggled over the relationship between gender and citizenship. Protectionists eventually prevailed at the end of the original ERA conflict. In the process, protectionists redefined the concept of full rights-bearing citizenship from a single gender masculine model to a dual gender model. Despite the generally well-meaning approach of many protectionists, their victory in the original ERA conflict led to the advancement of a gendered concept of citizenship that justifies a lack of equal treatment for women and the perpetuation of sex discrimination. The original ERA conflict then not only served as the vehicle through which Americans forged new concepts of citizenship, but it also produced a lasting belief in the supposed justice of sex-specific rights, which still shapes American society to this day. Now, many of you might be wanting to know more about how I use the term emancipationism in my work, so let me just touch on that point for a minute. In my work, emancipationism refers to a particular form of thought that developed after the passage of the 19th Amendment. It advocates for the absolute equality of men and women citizens before the law. And as noted, it also encapsulates the core ideas behind the pro-ERA position. So I use the words emancipationist and emancipationism to capture the pro-ERA position because ERA supporters drew upon the notion of fully emancipating women from a legal system that had historically given men authority over women. In fact, ERA supporters often use the exact word emancipate or to emancipate when describing the ERA's purpose. The ERA, according to Representative Louis Ludlow, a major supporter of the amendment, was the, quote, necessary corollary and supplement of equal suffrage. It's the crowning act that will bring women to a status of complete emancipation, which they are entitled by all the rules of right and justice, end quote. During the original ERA conflict, ERA supporters insisted that although the 19th Amendment affirmed women's standing as citizens in their own right, sex-based laws and customs continue to assign to women an inferior civic status. In ERA supporters' arguments for the amendment, they often pointed to how the remnants of the common law tradition of domestic relations, or the doctrine known as coverture, had sustained the constraints on women's civic autonomy. These restraints include limitations on women's right to hold public office, serve on juries, have ownership over their earnings, control property equally with their spouses, maintain an independent docile status, have an independent nationality status, and also work in certain occupations. For ERA supporters, such restrictions on newly legalized voters created not only fluctuating definitions of women's legal personhood, but also constitutional inconsistencies with regard to the rights of American citizens. So in the mindsets of ERA proponents, complete constitutional sexual equality was the only way to fully emancipate a class of voters from their legal subjugation. I'm also going to unpack how I use the word protectionist and protectionism in my book, because it might be confusing for people who haven't read my book. So as I use it in my book, protectionism represents a specific way of reasoning that primarily arose after the advent of federal women's suffrage. It does not refer exclusively to advocates of special labor legislation for women. Special labor legislation arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to regulate women's working conditions and shield them from economic exploitation. The basis for these laws drew from the idea that all women were mothers or potential mothers, and that their roles in the domestic realm necessitate extra special legal safeguards. As I explained throughout my book, the protectionist habit of thought not only included liberal-minded persons who opposed the ERA and backed special labor laws for women, but it also included conservative individuals who did not like labor laws. So to put it simply, protectionism espouses the virtues of sex-specific rights. It encompasses the core ideas behind the anti-ERA stance because both conservative and liberal ERA opponents criticized the ERA as a threat to the sex-based legal distinctions that upheld what they understood to be women's natural right to special protection. As one anti-ERA pamphlet alleged, quote, men and women are different in biological structure and social function. State laws regulating the working conditions for women, family support, guardianship of children, property and inheritance, marriage and divorce recognize these differences. To protectionists, sex-specific legal treatment recognized what they believed to be men and women's separate societal roles and responsibilities. A shared desire to preserve the law's ability to treat men and women differently on account of sex after the passage of the 19th Amendment fueled the protectionist position. Alongside this desire, protectionists believe that while the law should respect women as rights-bearing citizens, it should not categorically group women's rights with men's rights. As I describe in my book, protectionists reasoned that actual sexual fairness meant securing two distinct but equally valued sets of rights for men and women citizens. So a key point here is that the arguments against the ERA, especially during the original conflict, didn't simply revolve around the idea that women shouldn't have rights or that they should be denied their rights as full citizens. In actuality, ERA opponents insisted that they were the ones who were protecting women's rights as citizens. Through the course of the original ERA conflict, protectionists moved the argument against equal rights or equal legal treatment away from a pre-19th Amendment emphasis on the reasons to exclude women from certain rights of citizenship towards a post-19th Amendment emphasis on the need to protect and develop a distinct citizenship for women that supposedly came with its own set of rights. For protectionists, women's special rights include being exempted from military service, and that's going to change to being exempted from combat duty, which Tanya will talk about in her presentation. The other rights were being shielded from the ravages of industrial capitalism and kept safe in their domestic roles. In this sense, as I argue in my book, protectionists modernize the justification for sex-specific treatment by forming a new notion of full American citizenship, which include two separate standards of rights for men and women citizens. Until the early 1970s, the long-running struggle between protectionists and emancipationists defied conventional categories of political ideology. So what do I mean by that? Throughout the original ERA conflict, both the emancipationist and protectionist positions included pronounced liberal and conservative variations. So those who adhere to the emancipationist position range from conservatives such as Senator Edward Burke to liberals such as feminist activist Emma Guthrie Miller. While conservative-minded emancipationists supported the ERA as a way to remove what they believed to be unnecessary government practices that restricted women's ability to compete in the economic realm, liberal emancipationists saw the amendment as an effective tool for expanding social policy so that they could benefit men and women alike. Even with these differences, both conservative and liberal emancipationists expressed their support for the ERA in terms of ensuring that men and women citizens could enjoy the same standard of rights. Likewise, those who followed the protectionist line of reasoning also included liberal and conservative variations. So protectionists, for instance, include influential conservatives such as Senator Robert Taft, as well as prominent liberals like the first woman Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. Both conservative and liberal ERA opponents believed that women had a natural right to special protection. They just differed over where that protection should come from. For conservative ERA opponents, women's special protection should come from the male head of the household, while liberal ERA opponents believe that government reform efforts could also serve as an effective tool of protection for women. Even so, both conservative and liberal ERA opponents criticized the ERA as a threat to the sex-based legal distinctions that upheld what they understood to be women's natural right to special protection. So in the original conflict, conservatives and liberals were attracted to both the emancipationist and protectionist viewpoints. Over the course of the early 1970s, the ideological aspects of the ERA struggle did evolve to reflect what we now understand to be conventional political positions. More liberals came to adopt the campaign for gender equality, while more conservatives came to support the insistence on sex-specific legal standards. And this alignment is due to an ideological development that arose in the mid to late 1960s. That development transformed how people thought about the relationship between sex and gender, as intellectuals and activists began to examine how many of the stereotypical behavioral traits generally assigned to men and women were socially created concepts and not essential products of nature. This ideological shift also allowed for a more fluid understanding of gender and sex that theoretically expanded the societal position of women beyond what had been previously understood to be biologically inescapable roles in the domestic sphere. And Tanya will also discuss that development too in her presentation. But for now, it's important to note that the expansion of women's roles encouraged more liberals to back the ERA as a way to ensure that social benefits applied equally to the male or female parent responsible for childcare. As more liberals embraced emancipationism, the conservative wing of the protectionist position grew to engulf the anti-ERA campaign effort. Thus, by the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the new conceptualization of the relationship between sex and gender had heightened the liberal dimensions of emancipationism and the conservative components of protectionism. But my book is more interested in retracing the scenes, details, and debates of the ERA struggle at an earlier time when the conflict still surpassed the typical liberal and conservative disputes of 20th century America. By utilizing a wealth of primary source materials, such as the often overlooked congressional source materials on the ERA, my research shows that liberals and conservatives were not always opposed to one another when it came to the issue of absolute constitutional sexual equality. As the dynamics of the ERA conflict before the 1970s suggest, support for and opposition to the ERA are not positions that are fundamentally tied to either conservatism or liberalism. Ultimately, at its roots, the ERA struggle reflects a battle between two different interpretations of American citizenship and not a typical political fight between liberals and conservatives. By diving into the extensive congressional materials on the ERA from the 1920s to the early 1960s as well as using an array of archival collections and court cases, my book also shows that the ERA did not sit silently in Congress until the early 1970s. In fact, Congress held numerous hearings on the ERA during the original conflict, and it issued several reports on the amendment. As I detail in my book, even though the protectionist position dominated the ERA conflict in the 1920s, the socioeconomic upheavals of the Great Depression and World War II did create a considerable drive towards the emancipationist position. By the mid to late 1940s, for example, ERA supporters had grown to include Democrats and Republicans, working class and upper class Americans, as well as white and Black Americans. Protectionists did regain the dominant position in the post-World War II era, but as I discuss in my book, their victory was not a foregone conclusion to the original ERA conflict. Overall, my book provides a different perspective on the reasons for the gap between men and women's societal positions. While other works have chronicled the ways in which sex discrimination persisted in the wake of the 19th Amendment and even up to this day, my book argues that the disadvantages against women have persisted because protectionists updated the rationale for sex-specific treatment during the original ERA conflict. In the end, I argue that the original ERA conflict supplied the terrain that allowed Americans to reconceptualize the concept of citizenship so that it corresponded to the changes in women's legal status after the passage of the 19th Amendment. As I show in my book, protectionists updated the justification for sex-specific legal treatment in an effort to preserve the rationale for sex-based distinctions in law and in custom after the introduction of federal women's suffrage. In the process, protectionists created a separate and distinct standard of rights for men and women citizens. Moreover, the protectionist triumph over emancipationists at the end of the original ERA conflict produced a confidence in the legitimacy of sex-specific treatment that still informs the dominant cultural consensus to this day. But as I conclude, this protectionist notion of limited sexual equality also sustains the restrictions on women's autonomy because it excuses the discriminatory outlook that rights should be dependent on one's sex. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. Now I have to figure out how to stop presenting there. All right. I think, am I the only one unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
No, you're not. There we go.
Now we were thinking that we would do a 5-minute bathroom refresh drinks, get some more nibbles break,
Okay.
and meet back here before Tanya's presentation. That still sounding good? I'm getting some thumbs up.
Yes, I think that sounds great. So,
Okay.
like 3-minute break.
Yeah.
5 or 3-minute break.
Yeah, whatever.
We'll come back in a few.
We'll be back in a few. And for those that joined before, welcome during the presentation. And we'll do a Q&A after Tanya's given her presentation. So now I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Tanya Roth. And Tanya Roth earned her history and PhD from Washington University in St. Louis and teaches high school and middle school history at MICDS in St. Louis, Missouri. Her research has been recognized by the American Association of University Women, and in 2019, an early version of her Cold War book title, received the Society for Military History's Kaufman First Manuscript Prize. Tanya's writing has been published in the Washington Post, History News Network, and the Public Seminar. Her Cold War Women in the U.S. Military 1945 to 1980 explains how women gained a permanent role in national defense after World War II, defined as equals with servicemen. In the following decades, service women and their advocates continually fought to redefine equality. So everybody should be drinking, laying the groundwork for women's service today. So it's all yours, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's so much fun to be here and doing this with all of you. I know I've got my slide up. You should be able to see that. So we'll jump right in. Here we go. There are several big questions behind my work in her Cold War. I thought I would start with these tonight. And if you'll bear with me, I do have my presentation on a side monitor. So if I look to the side occasionally, you'll know why. The ones that I thought most stood out for tonight in light of what Rebecca and I are doing with thinking about our works in conversation with each other were these, thinking about, first of all, why did Congress allow women permanent military roles after World War II? It's quite often the story ends with World War II, and then all of a sudden they're servicewomen again by the end of the 20th century. What happened? But also, what did it mean for women to be equal in the military? One of the reasons I pursued this project starting so many years ago was that I found this notion really surprising to me, that there was a sense of equality, and what does that mean? But also, how does women's Cold War military service help us understand military service today? In particular, though, for tonight, you might be wondering, what does the military have to do with the Equal Rights Amendment, which is certainly a big point of conversation between Rebecca and I with our works. We've talked a lot about the connections between our work as we prepare for tonight, and we hope that after hearing both of us tonight, you'll see those connections as well, and those connections will give you new ways to think about what you know about the ERA and about women's military service. So I thought I would start tonight with thinking about why woman power. I just love that term. I think it's a really cool term, and I can't claim it as my own. Military and congressional leaders were using it way, way, way back in the 40s, possibly before. But I want to start with a little background on this, why the permanent rules after World War II. And to clarify a little bit more, it's worth noting that my focus is on women outside of the nursing field. The military nursing corps were created early in the 20th century after the Spanish-American War. They have a longer history. I'm happy to refer people to some really great works on them if you're interested. But for women who are not nurses, in particular, this is going through the legislation that I start with, and that drives a fair portion of this. Regardless, this may be more familiar images you may have seen of women in World War II. There were a few non-nurses serving in World War I, very small numbers, but World War II is the first time that the US military branches formally admitted women, and they served in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and the Coast Guard. So you can see the spars on the upper left, that's the Coast Guard, the women's equivalent in World War II. The waves were the way they referred to women in the Navy. The Marines were simply the Women Marine Corps Reserve, and the Women's Army Corps, or the WAC, is probably the one that arguably most well known, but also through the years had much larger numbers than any other service. The legislation for all of these was very clear. Women are in the military or serving alongside it early on, only for the duration of the war plus 6 months. This is temporary. We don't want women to serve in the military. They have other things to do that are more culturally appropriate. So this is just for the war. But when the war ended, there were several people who came to believe otherwise, that woman power was something that the military could really use. And two of those people in particular that I'll bring in tonight are General Dwight Eisenhower and Colonel Mary Halloran. Eisenhower became the Army Chief of Staff in 1945, and the way he tells it is that during World War II, when they first wanted to have women serve with him, he thought there's no way. He called himself a converted skeptic, that he came to believe that, yes, woman power, really important, we should use it. So almost immediately after the war's end, he starts directing his staff to please create some legislative draft that we can pass on to Congress, so we can try to get some traction on this. Colonel Mary Halloran served in the Women's Army Corps in World War II, and although the people above her at the time were happy with the for the duration bit, she was not. She and a few others really did believe as well that if women wanted to continue serving, let them serve. It was a great career opportunity in her mind and many other people's minds. So these two voices in particular come to the fore, and I talk about them quite a bit early in the book. There's a couple big arguments why woman power, and none of them focus on women's rights. This is about practicality. To give you a sense of that, I have a couple of maps that I think might put a little context. So this is US bases around the world in 1939, roughly, just before World War II started. You can see there's US presence in various parts of the world, but it's not very large. Mostly it's centered in the Western Hemisphere. But if we jump to the end of World War II, take a look at the contrast in 1945. There's US people everywhere in varying degrees. And this map does not speak to the varying ways in which these locations are being used, but you can see the United States presence in the world is expanding as a result of the war. Military leaders knew that although the war was over, they still needed people, and with the draft ending and American men still coming home from the war, one argument was, you know, if we use women, we can get those men home sooner, really prioritizing getting those fathers and sons and brothers back home. They're hoping that will also mean they don't have to draft people anymore. Yay, and the draft. So as they start debating this, they start thinking about, okay, how are we going to structure women's service? What do we do here? My apologies, I went forward too fast, and that's okay. We're going to leave it there. Many argued it was more practical to make women equal. There were some early challenges in the war when they had done some unequal structure, didn't quite work very well, just some really practical differences. If a woman is not military, can she still shop on base at the post exchange, for example? What benefits is she entitled to, etc. So drawing from that experience, a lot of higher ups made the argument that you just got to make the women equal. It's much easier that way. Again, they're not thinking women's rights. Yay! It's just we're going to use women. Let's make it practical. And this is James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense in the U.S. military. He argued this in particular. He and Eisenhower were both very vocal on this regards. And Forrestal's point was, if we're going to use women in the armed forces, we should go the whole way and give them identical status and benefits as men. Turns out there was a kind of a qualifier to that, but he's all in on this argument. But what happens is that finally, it takes a while, on June 12th, 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act becomes law, and that law provides a permanent place for women in the military on an equal basis with men. But they define equality in a way that I call gender difference. Rebecca used the word protectionism, and hers goes a little different, but there's some overlap in how these can be imagined and understood. The law has a number of provisions that are important to know. For example, it is one of the things that's remarkable is that women enter the military with equal pay, which I didn't put on the slide, but it's the important part that I need to mention here. There's really no other employer aside from the federal government who's offering equal pay to women at this time. There's some women in union jobs who are trying to fight for it, but this isn't yet a national rallying cry like it will be with the women's movement starting in the 60s and 70s. And these women get equal pay right away in the military, and that's really huge. It's in this the focus on equal pay would become an important selling point for military recruiters, but when we look a little closer, we see a few other things. So yes, permanent military roles. Women will not fight. They will be non-combatants because we don't need them to fight. That's what the men are there for. There are rank limitations imposed upon them. They cannot go higher than colonel as a temporary grade or captain. They're never going to become generals. The idea is we don't need women generals. Why would we need women generals or admirals? They'll change their mind a few decades later. But at this time, not happening. Spouses cannot be dependents. They're imagining mostly that the women who come to serve will probably be young single women. They're also imagining they're going to be young white single women. If they get married, that's totally fine, but they're going to get married and have children. So they're going to leave the military, as we'll see in just a little bit. They don't want to have a situation where a servicewoman can walk in and say, I'm married and my husband needs benefits. He's my spouse. It's a period when they're focused on male breadwinners, the male head of the household. So the idea that any man would need dependent benefits, unless he relies on his wife for at least 50% of his support, they're not going there. If you're under the age of 21, your parents have to sign off on your military service. Men, in contrast, if you were under the age of 18, you needed permission to join the military. And there's a 2% ceiling on women power. Yes, bring women in, but we won't need more than 2% of the military to ever be female at any point. So we'll just do this. So it's very heavily based on this idea. There's my equal pay right there. Some of the early advertisements, you can see that on the right, they really are thinking of this comprehensively. There's the equal pay, there's training and education and promotions, retirement pay, insurance, leave with pay, medical expenses. It is the job that has everything. It's they're really thinking of this as something very forward thinking for the time. But they're defining equality based on gender difference. I believe I lost a slide here. Bear with me here. I lost a slide. I don't know how that happened. Well, we're just going to go with it. Everybody take a drink, and I'm just going to figure out where I am. I take a drink. There we go. We'll stay here for just a minute. Equality in the military then is equal pay, equal benefits, career opportunities. But equality in the military is also limited. We're going there. Wow. Okay. I really went backwards here. I am having a stellar night, and you guys are awesome. So you just want to see the pictures again. We're going to do it.
I still can't see any of the slides because of my computer, so you're
hey,
good
that's
to go.
all right. I'm doing great then, Rebecca. All right. Something has happened here. Bear with me. No, there it is. I found it. Okay, I moved them. Maybe that's what I did. All right, so what we were really seeing in the military is that the 1948 Women's Armed Service Integration Act defined equality based on gender difference. So equality is going to mean let's maintain existing gender ideals, recognize differences between men and women, and equality for them will mean they're hitting equality if they're putting women into the roles best suited for them because they're women. And there's some really interesting conversations about that. No mothers. No, that's not going to happen. Those rank limitations are huge. No combat, 2% ceiling, job restrictions. That's what equality in the military means. It means we're equal, but all these things help define equality in ways that we don't really think of as equal anymore. But there's an interesting element as well that is important to note as well. This law passes June 12th, 1948. 6 weeks later, President Truman desegregates the military with Executive Order 9981. During World War II, African-American women had served in the women's services, mostly the Women's Army Corps. The Navy did not admit them until very close to the end of the war. I don't believe the Marine Corps ever did in World War II. So there's many limits on their service in the segregated units. Men were also segregated through World War II. When Truman desegregates, it's 6 weeks after this law. That means as the women's services are really getting going after the war in those couple of years that follow, all of the women's services racially integrate before the men's services do. Some of the first training boot camps for the women Marines, they have entire conversations about the fact that they're going to have women of different races living alongside each other in barracks in the American South. So there's a whole lot of interesting discussions that happen there. So there's opportunities for African-American women that are not going to exist elsewhere. It doesn't mean that this is going to be come into this job and you're going to have equality, of course, but it does open some doors in very important ways that African-American women, by having access to the military service, before African-American men as well. But in the decades that follow, the gender difference vision of equality comes under challenges constantly and in a number of ways. And women are the ones challenging these, mostly focused on gender. Whether there are times challenging based on race, but gender is mostly what I'm looking at in hearing from their stories. So women themselves in particular are leading the charge against these limitations. And this is where Major Alba Martinelli Thompson comes in, one of my favorite stories, early in the 50s. The whole no mothers prohibition, this is where she comes in to say, let's redefine what you mean by equality. Why does that mean no mothers? Thompson's a World War II veteran. She'd stayed in the service afterwards. She's trained in multiple Eastern Asian languages. And she met her husband while they were both serving overseas in East Asia. In 1951, they want to discharge her from the reserves. She ends up testifying to Congress about this, does not get to stay in the military. They pretty much disagree with her that women can actually be parents and serve. But a year later, members of Congress were talking about her testimony and still using her as this discussion of, well, maybe we should rethink this. And I really love what she said when she spoke to Congress about women and motherhood and military service and the challenges that this military definition of equality was bringing for women. It cannot be denied that any organization comprised exclusively of women must face the inescapable facts that a great many of its young women will marry and will become mothers. This is not to say that motherhood renders them a complete loss to the service, no more than having children makes them a liability in the business and labor world. A realistic attack of this problem would have faced the irrefutable facts and would have brought into being regulations which safeguard health, provide for pregnancy leaves, and protect seniority and retirement benefits. As a servicewoman who has, by the time she leaves, nearly a decade of service, she's certainly thinking about these long-term benefits. Most important of all, a conscious attempt would be made to utilize to the fullest extent possible the invaluable training and skills of these women so that the richest return on a considerable national investment should be realized. None of these things has been accomplished by the Army. So within 3 years, she's coming at the military and saying, you promised us this equality, and yet you're so short-sighted in how you imagine this that you're not actually accomplishing what you might be able to. She plants a seed for the potential for change. It's going to take quite a while longer for them to make these changes, but early on, she's one of the forerunners of, hey, let's really think about what we mean when we talk about equality. Through the 50s, really the best the military does is my favorite, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. I'm a little obsessed with Dakowitz, I'm not going to lie. 1951, as this is playing out, the Department of Defense says, you know, we could use some women to help us figure out this woman power thing. And Anna Rosenberg is the first female Assistant Secretary of Defense. They bring her in, they're like, get us some women, help us figure out how to use woman power. She does. And Dakowitz is a group of civilian women. They are predominantly white, but they also include several prominent African-American activists over the years. And their goal is twofold, is publicity and advocacy. Make sure Americans know about career opportunities for women in the military. They get equal pay, they can travel, they can serve in Japan and see the world, they get unique educational opportunities. We could totally change American womanhood if they all just join the military for a few years. They're really kind of envisioning it like a finishing school in a lot of ways, finishing school for citizenship. In terms of advocacy, what do service women need? And that includes a number of things like better housing, education, get rid of those rank limitations, because as women start having longer careers, not all of them, but a small group of them, those rank limitations are going to affect whether they can actually stay in the military as long as they'd like to. Revisit the question of women's relationship to combat. That comes a little bit later in the 60s and 70s, but they will be the ones at the forefront saying, hey, let's talk about this. They address the question of mothers in uniform. And in my book, what I look at is that in particular in the 50s and the 60s, before the rise of the national women's movement and second wave feminism, the women of Dakowitz are the crucial advocates for woman power. The other group whose voice is coming in is Kennedy's President's Commission on the Status of Women. So about a decade later, President Kennedy creates the PCSW, as I like to call it, to study the status of women in the US. And this includes women in the military. There's some crossover. There are several members of Dakowitz who serve with the President's Commission. One of the biggest outcomes here is that working together, frankly, they help get the removal of rank limitations. It takes till 1967, but it happens. And the PCSW, thinking back to Rebecca's work, they're trying to maintain protectionism. So it's a really interesting group. Again, they're not really seeing themselves as, okay, we're going to liberate women. And, it is about rights, but it's about rights that seem reasonable based on the environment. It's not considered anything radical or feminist, nor does it seem counter to protectionism, but a recognition that this is one area where women need access rather than limitations. They've had distinguished military careers. There seems to be no viable reason for limiting the women who are ready for those promotions. All this means is that by the time the ERA comes back into play in the 70s, although as Rebecca and I have discussed, it doesn't entirely disappear. It's just that it takes on that national vision in the 1970s. The military becomes more important in the discussions around the ERA. A shift starts to happen in the 60s, actually, away from gender difference and toward gender sameness. So again, I kind of cued similarities to Rebecca's terminology, and I don't know if it's necessarily a perfect term for term, but to get some parallels there. Gender sameness philosophy, as it starts to come in, is focusing more on let's remove special protections for women. Let's recognize that the things that we think are appropriate for women are based on assumption, not capability. And that in this approach, equality will mean using individuals on the basis of their abilities rather than assuming what they can do because of their gender. The removal of rank limitations means that women begin to serve at higher levels of leadership, and there are more of them at the higher levels. So by the summer of 1970, we have the first women promoted to the rank of general. General Elizabeth Hoisington on the left for the Women's Army Corps, and General Anna Mae Hayes of the Army Nurse Corps. Of course, the irony, if that's the best word, at the ceremony where they were promoted to general, the general who got given their promotions then kisses them each on the cheek. So, you know, still thinking about the stereotypes of women and what should be done with them is alive and well in 1970. Over the course of the 1970s, there are more generals. We get the first 2-star female general in the Air Force, for example. And the rise of the women's movement in the 60s and 70s means that more attention to limitations on service women keep coming. Women continue to push back. So for example, in the Navy, Jordine von Wantock had been in the military for close to 20 years before she and her military husband became pregnant. So she pushes back on mandatory separation from service and says, look, I am so close to retirement. Can I just stay in the military until I hit retirement qualifications? And they say, okay, we'll let you do that. That's fine. They do, by the time she gets to that point, they've changed the rules and they've decided women can stay if they have children. And she doesn't retire until the 1980s after that. I think her daughter's in high school by the time she leaves. Frontero versus Richardson. It's the first case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg argues in front of the Supreme Court in the early 70s, and that's a huge game changer on those dependent benefits that women could not have starting back in 1948. Frontero versus Richardson, the Supreme Court says you can't do that. You have to give women equal spouse benefits. You can't put these limitations on it for, you know, men have to be dependent for half their service. So spouses of service women can have dependent benefits, and they also, women whose spouses had not been eligible prior were back credited. So it's a big moment of change there. By the time the ERA passed both houses of Congress and went to the states for ratification starting in about 72, it's clear the ERA is creating new questions about women's military service. Watching this out of the periphery means a lot of military leaders are thinking on their feet and going, how will this affect the armed forces if the ERA goes through? There's a lot of discussion about this. Outside of the military, the anti-ERA voices do make drafting women one of their planks. They're bolstered by the recent Vietnam drafts. But the questions they're really asking are not just how will it affect their service, but will women have to serve in combat? What's going to happen to the service academies that had never admitted women? And the service academies were seen as a place to train for combat. Would American women be drafted? But even more, inside the military, the prospect of the ERA allows for embracing this newer vision of equality based on gender sameness. So mothers in service, by 1974, that changes for Jordine von Wantock. She can stay in the Navy. The benefits, of course, as I mentioned earlier, in 1976, the military academies admit women for the first time. And by 1978, there are no more women's services left. They've gotten rid of all of the administrative roles they set, like the director of the Women's Army Corps, the assistant chief of naval personnel for women, all these little divisions inside that were designed to help administer women's service over the years. It really becomes an embracing of gender sameness, and it's creating a major shift inside the military. So what's the upshot of all this? by the end of the 1970s, women's military service begins to look like what I think most of us think of today when we think of women in the military. Women can carry guns. They wear camouflage. There are still limitations on them in the 80s and 90s. For example, theoretically no combats. They're still in very restricted roles, but they're more visible and they're a larger presence than ever. Policies related to combat begin to shift in the 1990s, such as the restrictions against aviation combat. But it's only been in the last decade that restrictions on women in combat have disappeared. And only in the past year did we see, for example, the Marine Corps doing sexually integrated boot camps. I think the first one was last January, for example. Equality today looks far different than 1948 or 1967 or 1973, and servicewomen continue to redefine it. For example, one of the things I think about in my book is the issues that servicewomen are actively fighting today. It's not that they're new issues, but for example, one of the issues today is mothers in uniform. How do we address physical standards after pregnancy and childbearing and nursing? How do we support women in those roles as well so that they can be mothers and have a military career? Those questions couldn't even have been asked 50 years ago because it wasn't something that women could do in the military. Sexual assault, it's been there. It's always been there. Nobody's talked about it. Just like racism, all these things have been present for decades, but now we have a space where you can have these conversations. Getting rid of the barriers means opening up room to have new improvements and to continue to redefine what equality means. And servicewomen today are doing just that. So I hope that, thank you for listening and for bearing with my slide mishaps. I hope that this intrigues you and that you enjoyed hearing it and that we'll have a good conversation about women's equality.
Awesome job, Tanya, and awesome job, Rebecca, from before. And I think we're going to do another 3 to 5 minute break, essentially.
Do you think we should do a quick one again?
I don't know how we do. Do we do a poll?
I know. I don't know how. Okay, so let's just do a quick bathroom break for anyone that wants to go to the bathroom.
We may not do, so we could use the time for those of us who don't need to use the bathroom. You can either type questions into the comment box or raise your hand, and I think it puts you in a queue so we can sort of go through the list.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Be back in a couple of minutes.
Raise my hand here. Okay, we're on. Go ahead. Oh, I don't know if they chose us or not.
Hello, you two. Are you on there?
Hey, can you hear us?
We can.
Okay, Alan has a comment.
Oh,
I'm
awesome.
so proud of my student, Rebecca DeWolf.
She's done awesome.
Best student I ever had in 48 years.
Wow.
How about that? Tracy, you can be just as good. I'm still waiting for you to come back.
And I told Rebecca that she is the Alan Lichtman of her generation. When I heard her on the podcast, she was so knowledgeable, so very articulate, so very forceful. I was just so impressed, and keep up the great work. And it's nice to meet you too, Tanya. Good
Yes,
job.
thanks, Tanya. It was great stuff.
Thank you so much for being here.
You know, you may call her the Alan Lichtman of the generation. She's way better looking.
You have to compare the hair. So, you know.
Yeah, right.
This is real.
It's real.
We'll have somebody check Rebecca when she gets back.
Thanks. This was very informative. We loved it.
Take care.
Oh, bye, you guys.
See ya.
Love
Good
you lot.
job. Great job, Tracy.
Oh, thank you. Love you lot.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Is that Julia?
No, it's me.
Oh, Rebecca. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, Julia. Yeah. I can't say who I have on the bottom bar there. So
I know. It's All right. Are people asking questions? Or?
We do have a question.
Okay.
But I don't know if we want to wait just one more
Oh,
minute
okay.
or
Did they raise their hand or did they type it in?
typed it in. So it's from Nathaniel Green.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I raised my hand. I didn't mean to do that. I don't think I have
Oh,
to.
okay.
Sorry.
She has a question about your hair, Rebecca.
My hair.
I think you missed when Alan was saying that he was really proud of you and you're the best student he's had in 48 years. And
Oh,
you're the next Alan Lichtman or the new Alan Lichtman. And I was
that's
teasing
so
that we'll have to compare your hair.
oh, that's so
And
sweet.
Aaron was saying his
That
is all
means the
real.
world to me.
Yeah, 'cause I think they had to get going. So
Oh, okay. I was honored to be his advisee. So I learned from the best. Okay.
okay, so I think I could probably go ahead and start reading the questions so you guys can start formulating a little bit at least. So Nathaniel was asking, I was wondering if you both could discuss the transition from dissertation to book. How did your projects evolve from defense to published book?
Okay. I think,
Whichever
okay.
you wanted to start with that one.
I think Candy's also asking a question too. Is that what that raised? Is this check mark thing mean here? I don't know. All right. So dissertation to book. It was a really long process. I think Tanya was like me that it took a really long time. I got the dissertation done and I need to walk away from it for a little while. I defended my dissertation in 2014. I had kids, which preoccupied my time a lot. But it was always in the back of my head. But I had to revise it considerably to make it a book. Like a dissertation is a lot more research and boring to read, and a book, you have to kind of try to hook people in and also tie it to greater historical trends and stuff. So in a dissertation, you're also trying to prove your authority. So you are constantly saying, well, this person did this person did that, but I'm going to do this. So it's a constant battle of showing that you actually know what you're talking about. And when you get to the book stage, you don't have to give all of that foundation because your authority is assumed because you had defended a dissertation, So Tanya, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, like Rebecca, I graduated in 2011 and I didn't pick this back up till 2016 because I transitioned to teaching high school and time. I also I always knew I wanted to write the book. I just also was very sick of it and needed to step away. And I think stepping away was the best thing that I did for this because that time, lots of things changed in the military in that time. When I defended, they had just, right after my defense, they just announced the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So it's like, oh, hey, look, important changes. But a lot of restructuring for me. There's a lot that I kept in, but there's a number of, there's a really great story I love about women's uniforms in Vietnam. Somebody else put that in their book in the time between my defense and my doing the book. And that's okay. Heather Stur's an amazing historian and her book is fantastic. But I looked at that and went, yeah, I can't use that anymore. That's the risk when it takes so long. But not a lot of women are working, or not a lot of scholars are working on service women in this period. So for me, it was a lot about finding what's this new structure. And I ended up breaking it down to, okay, I think I need to look at, part one of the book focuses on how did military leaders envision women's service. So it starts with the Integration Act and how it came about, then focus on recruiting and training. So it's that top down. What are they thinking of when they think woman power, or what does it look like? Then part two became, what are women's lived experiences? It's a reorganization from the dissertation and lots of shortening. My 50-page chapters are now like 20 pages, so yay. And that ends up with motherhood, women's jobs, a chapter on women's jobs, a chapter on motherhood, and then a chapter on lesbianism in the military. The final part is sort of the transition to world equality stuff comes together. How are advocates pushing for change for service women? How are service women also doing it? So it sort of goes top down, bottom up, everybody together, if that makes sense. And But I think that the structure I think it works a lot better to tell the story. I think I tried to do something chronological and thematic in a weird way before. And this, I think, gives it a much better sense of being able to see the evolution of equality from its original intentions to what it becomes by the 70s. So unrelatedly, because I see there's a question about what brought to the research, since I think it's kind of related. I took a fabulous undergraduate seminar on women in World War I when I was at University of Missouri many years ago. I knew nothing about gender history. I knew nothing about wars. And we read Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, and I was just captivated. Why were women volunteering to go into war? What did that mean? So I did an undergraduate thesis on women volunteering as nurses in World War I, and then I just couldn't put it down. It just kind of, they've haunted me ever since.
Okay. So, should I answer the how did I get to the topic, or should we do Candy's question?
Yeah.
What are you saying, Tracy?
So what brought you to your research?
Okay. I'm checking to see if Professor Lickman's still here, because he played a big part in that. So
I think they said goodbye.
Okay. So, okay. When I was a first year PhD student, Professor Lickman asked me to give a lecture on the ERA. And at that point, I was still coming around to doing American history. So I didn't know a whole bunch about the ERA, but I kind of dived into it just to prepare for the lecture. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. But the most interesting aspect was, after I gave the lecture, I opened it up to discussion to the students. And to my amazement, the students either A, didn't know that the ERA never passed, or B, they didn't see the ERA as being a solution to the disadvantages that women still face. So that just really sparked my curiosity, why there was such a disconnect between the recognition of persistent sex discrimination and not seeing the ERA as a solution. So I wanted to solve that mystery, and that's how I came to the topic.
Okay, and then we had a question for Tanya. It says, as you know, the Army is struggling to implement the gender-neutral Army combat fitness test. Can you think of any examples from your research, if necessary, changes that came to fruition after overcoming some fits and starts? I read that wrong, sorry about that. What pushed it over the top? Time, necessity, legislation, or something else?
That's a great question. I think the rank limitations definitely had fits and starts for sure. It sort of has a longer, we should try to get rid of this. Oh, we don't need women at upper levels. We can get away without it. And I think some of the reasons they were able to say that was so is that they never met recruiting goals. So year over year, the number of women in the military grows, but the military also grows in the Cold War. So their percentages go down. So it seems to take, in that case, it was the President's Commission on the Status of Women and Dakowitz, but also Lyndon Johnson happened to have a secretary who was in the military, and he was bound to determine she was going to become a colonel. So that also helped, having pressure in various places. But it's been a lot of persistence. And even women as mothers, same thing. I'm really interested in the new fitness tests, and I haven't paid as close attention as I would like to pay to them, but I'm really interested in this question of how we define, how do we know it's neutral versus what it was before? So I'm really interested in the questions of physicality that are going on, and I feel like it really, the women themselves play an important role in making that change. They can't do it by themselves. That never seems sufficient. That their voices are always there pushing back, but they always need something bigger to help them. So I'm curious to see what that's going to be. In some cases, with combat aviation, it was Desert Storm changes things because women are kind of there. We kind of need them. So if that makes sense, if that answers the question, it seems to be definitely persistence from women themselves, but also there has to be something higher up to help it. But I think all those things, time and necessity and legislation at times.
Thank you for answering my question. Great job.
And I think we have another question by the person who had earlier said that all of our struggles were due to Mercury retrograde, which I loved. I thought that was really funny and true. It says this may be beyond scope, but I'd like to know if either of you came across source material regarding how the increasing visibility of trans and non-binary people affects the dialogue around biology, protectionism, and equality in the military.
I think that's a really great question. And I'm trying to think of the best way to answer it. So, I was asked like last week during like a podcast interview, like who are the heirs to protectionism or liberal protectionism? And I didn't have the best answer because I had to think about it. And I would say that I see in the arguments and the discourses coming out from people who are exclusionary towards transgender people or gender nonconforming people or non-binary people. It sounds very reminiscent of the discussions that you see with liberal protectionists in the 20s up to the early 1960s. This idea that women have a biological necessity for specific rights that shouldn't apply to other people. So I don't know if that fully answered his question, but I would say I think that the arguments for the ERA, understanding that sex shouldn't be a way to determine someone's rights, does align with arguments for rights for transgender people. So
I love how you answered that, Rebecca.
Oh,
That's
good.
great. Yeah. I have to admit, I was sitting here going, what do I see? Because I stopped so early, relatively. I have not found a lot of source material about that. But it makes me think about there's one case of transgender service in my period that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are many others, or maybe not many, but I'm sure there are others. But in the 70s, there was an instance where it made huge news, not huge news stories, but I found it in the archives under WAC marriage case. I'm like, what's this? And it was a member of the Women's Army Corps got married while on duty in Alabama by a justice of the peace, and her spouse came into the base to get access to the post exchange, etc. And somebody working there was like, I recognize you, you're a former member of the WAC, and it was a transgender individual. And the justice of the peace had no idea that he had married two people who were biologically female, and said it was totally legal. And this is the 1970s, so I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. Nobody had thought about prohibiting that yet. The military ends up discharging the wife based on homosexuality, but they just seem totally confused. They bring in gender experts from a university in Texas to try to talk about gender identity, and that's about as far as I can get. But it's a really interesting moment that I'd be curious to see if there's more of those, or to hear more stories of that. That's as close as I can get.
Okay, so we have another question that the military has more women and is more gender neutral than ever. Now with these military women as our official protectors, do you think this cuts into the anti-ERA argument of protection?
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'll just say, and then I'll let Tanya take it, but one of the arguments against the ERA was that because women can't take on the same civic responsibilities as men, such as military service or combat duty, they can't be held to the same rights as men, because responsibilities come with rights, or responsibilities come with rights. So the fact that you're seeing more and more women into the military service just kind of smacks that argument in its face, because women are capable. So
yeah, I think it totally undermines it entirely. It goes back to that idea I was talking about, that all these things, oh, women can't do that. It's all based on assumptions, and just because a woman never had done it before didn't mean they couldn't do it. They discovered that women could change tires and fix trucks in World War II, and they're like, oh, that's kind of cool. It's just I think we see such a actually two things I think are really interesting. And if anybody has seen articles to the contrary, please let me know and share them with me. But it seemed like for a long, long time, we get this narrative of, oh my gosh, women in combat. Oh no, Jessica Lynch, she's been captured. Oh no, what's going to happen to these women who are serving so close to combat? And yet in August, with the deaths of servicemen and women in Afghanistan, I was looking for this, and again, if anybody saw it, send it my way. But I didn't hear any of that old rhetoric about how, oh my gosh, it's so horrible. These women have died in combat. We shouldn't have women there. The conversation seemed like it had totally shifted to just, are men and women in uniform. They gave their lives in the ultimate sacrifice. There was no debate over the appropriateness of whether a woman should have been serving in Afghanistan in a place to die anyway. So I think that struck me as maybe that conversation is changing in ways that we aren't yet fully recognizing. So I think that's really interesting.
Okay, let's see. Here's another question. Examples of women influencing peaceful, non-confrontational approaches in the context of military planning, etc. Women more likely to be doves than hawks.
So
I don't know. Go ahead, Rebecca, go for it.
The question made me think of something, but I don't think it's actually answering the question. So I'll just say, in the original ERA conflict, there was a pervasive gender norm, which even ERA supporters thought that women were morally superior and that women were society's nurturers and caregivers. So I would say the idea that, if a woman's in charge, we're going to have more peace. That idea, I kind of, it's faulty in that it doesn't allow women to be a diverse group, So I don't know. I mean, I kind of just spitfiring here, but Tanya probably has more of a better answer than I do.
Yeah, I heard a really great talk today, or not today, yes, Wednesday, from the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security about the question they were grappling with was, does the presence of women change the conversation about, or does it change how militaries operate? And I think that goes to that question, like, if we have more women, are we going to see more doves versus hawks, for example? And I don't know, but I think that we're moving closer and closer to a place where, because we're having more women in upper roles, we can see what that means and how that affects what militaries do. I'm thinking about I cannot think of the term, but in the early 2000s, the lionesses. The efforts to send women into parts of the Middle East and possibly Afghanistan to use female engagement teams to go into the places where we had troops and to use women to interact with local women. And I read just one book about this, and I thought it was so fascinating, this concept of using women, kind of in a way of like thinking about, maybe in part because there's societies where women still have very traditional roles, but having women go in and engage with other women and thinking about how we revisit occupation or conflict by having by using women as women. That's a very half thought out answer, but I think there's some really interesting things that are worth thinking about in these years ahead to watch and see how things change.
Okay, so I'm typing the answer to Michelle's question here, and I'll just say it out loud instead of typing it. I think it's a great argument. It highlights how, so she had asked, one of the arguments that ERA advocates make is that 16% of the military is now female. Those service members are required to swear on an oath to the Constitution. That doesn't provide equal rights for women. Is that a pervasive argument? I would say yes, because it highlights that women can contribute and participate in society on the same terms as men, and that should be recognized in the Constitution. All right, what do you think, Tracy? Time-wise, how are we doing on the clock?
You'd wanted to wrap up about 9, didn't you?
I just want to make sure we had time for everything.
I think as long as, I think we've answered the questions. So generally, I mean, there's really great comments, which are wonderful, and I'm sure you guys will read and get to.
Oh yes, thank you, Michelle. I'm really interested. I'm going to look at those. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to look at those too.
And so I have to do the other housekeeping job, don't I, of announcing the winners of the two winners of the 2-book giveaway. Let me find those. So the first one was EXR187 at case.edu. So the winners will have to send in their address to Rebecca.
Yeah, just send your addresses to me and Tanya either through Twitter or email, find us somehow.
Awesome.
Send us your address.
We have a confirmation for that one, so that's good. Okay, and the second one was Rick Geisel or Giesel. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, at gmail.com.
I think he was here before. I'm not sure if he's still here.
Does that disqualify him then? So next
No.
You have his email to contact him, so
yeah,
we will be
I'll
reaching
have
out
to write a note
to Rick.
by myself that.
Yeah, so those were the two that were getting the 2 book prizes. And Rebecca, were you wanting to do any trivia?
So we had thought that maybe we would do a quick trivia, like I would have a question, Tanya would have a question, and whoever tries to answer it first, my question, then Tanya's question, will get some swag, like some bookmarks and a book plate. So if you guys are willing to play, I'll give a quick question. Was Frances Perkins an ERA supporter?
And
I
I think
have to get it right. I'll still send you swag.
You're just sending to everybody at this point.
I know. Anyone could just go. No, yes, she was not an ERA supporter. That is correct. I think it's Alicia Assey answered first?
I see Michelle first at 8 o'clock. I see Michelle, then Erin. then
Oh,
Alicia, then Colleen.
Michelle asked first. Okay. All right, Tanya, you're
Okay. Can anybody name one of the 2 people who was fighting for women to stay in the military after World War II? Nate Williams has Ike. All right. And then Colleen. Lisa, thank you for mentioning Colonel Halloran. Excellent. Ike is great too. We like both of them. All right.
And again, is that a case of sending addresses? For
Yes.
those who want things? Yes.
We'll reach out to you and get your addresses. We have your emails from the registration, so you'll hear from Rebecca and me, and we'll get your addresses.
all right. This was so much fun. Thank you, everyone, for coming and letting us talk. And hopefully, I didn't ramble or anything. So, it was great.
Thank you so much.
I'm
This
so
was
happy
wonderful.
that we got to do this.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and remember to buy the book. And the discount code, I think everybody has, at least in the comments. And I can't wait to read your books. So thank you guys. This is wonderful. I should be saying not thank you guys. That's wrong.
Yeah, I know.
In the Northwest, it's a bad habit. I'll just blame that on geography. So yes, thank you both very much.
Thank you all for
right.
coming. See you later.
Have a good night, everyone.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.